Alright, so my presentation is going to be about suicide and self-injury in LGBTQ youth. So to get an introduction and a relevance as to why you need to know about this, as a counselor, I want to start with what LGBTQ means. So that means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and more. So there are other identities like asexuality or pansexuality or being non-binary that are not included in the acronym but are in the group. Additionally, it is important to define self-injury, which the Trevor Project defines as the purposeful damage of one's own body without suicidal intent and for purposes not socially or culturally sanctioned. So this can include cutting, hitting yourself so hard that you bruise, scraping yourself, and this can be done for intrapersonal reasons or interpersonal reasons. So that can mean that you're really upset with yourself or that you're being bullied or hurt by others. Looking at Gen Z specifically, about 21% of Gen Z adults identify as LGBTQ+. Interestingly, if you look at the generations, more and more people in the generations are identifying as LGBTQ. If you look at millennials, about 12% of adults identify as LGBTQ. And so this is not a statistic specifically for Gen Z youth or teenagers. However, it is safe to assume that it is about a similar amount, or if not more, that of teenagers that identify as LGBTQ. Also, interestingly, a lot more people are gravitating to the term queer as opposed to a very specific identity. Also, Gen Z is the most diverse in sexuality, gender identity, and racial and ethnic backgrounds, which makes intersectionality that much more important. Intersectionality is super important because additional discrimination can happen based on race and ethnicity of certain individuals in this group in addition to their LGBTQ identity. Also, something interesting that Gen Z face is they have a lot of an online community, so lots of LGBTQ youth in Gen Z are out online but closeted in real life, which creates a certain tension and can manifest itself in anxiety. Also, there are transgender specific challenges, and so it is important to note that this is not a homogeneous group and different identities within this larger group face different challenges. Alright, so looking at the research. So, of the population of LGBTQ people between the ages of 13 and 24, 54% in total said that they had self-injured in the last year. If you look at just teenagers, 13 to 17-year-olds, that's about 63%. And if you look from 18 to 24, that is about 41%. The group with the highest incidence of self-harming was transgender boys and men with a rate of 72%. And if you look at transgender girls and women, that rate is 52%. And non-binary teens have a higher rate of self-injury than cisgender peers. Also, this is a graph of looking at self-injury based on race and ethnicity, and you can see that Native and Indigenous LGBTQ youth have a higher percent of self-injury compared to white LGBTQ youth, and you can also kind of compare them. The multiracial LGBTQ youth also have a higher rate than a lot of the other ethnicities in this graph. And then it was interesting to see what this motivation for self-injury is. There have been research done in non-LGBTQ youth who self-injure, and they have found that intrapersonal reasons, so basically like being upset with yourself or trying to relieve tension, has been a big motivator for self-injury, and this was found in LGBTQ youth as well. And so if you look up here, the top 5 reasons people self-injure is on this graph, with the number 1 to be to cope with uncomfortable feelings, for example, depression and anxiety. Also, looking at suicide specifically, suicide and self-injury are linked. If you look at this graph, you will see that LGBTQ youth who have self-injured have a higher rate of seriously contemplating suicide or attempting suicide compared to LGBTQ youth who have not self-injured in the last year. Also, regardless of self-injury, suicide risk is greater for LGBTQ youth compared to their peers at about 20% of attempted versus 5.9% in their heterosexual and cisgender peers. Looking at transgender boys, about 50.8% have attempted, and transgender girls only about 30% have attempted. And those transgender boys are the group with the highest rate of attempted suicides. The non-binary people also have a 41.8% suicide attempt rate, which is also very high and significantly higher than their cisgender peers. So advocacy and social justice. So people in this community experience homophobia and transphobia. Specifically, teens face it a lot in schools, and there are also a lot of policies that are anti-LGBTQ and anti-transgender that are being introduced in state legislators and even in the national legislature. The article that I looked at was updated in 2022, and so it said there have been over 200 of these bills that were proposed in 2022, and they had already had 150 that were pre-introduced for 2023. And if you read the news, you'll know that there are still more that are being put out. This does have a large toll on the mental health of the LGBTQ community. 86% of transgender and non-binary youth say that these policies negatively affect their mental health, and 71% of the LGBTQ community at large say that these policies negatively affect mental health. Additionally, like going for places, safe spaces like pride parades, community centers, affect the community as well, and it's 75% of LGBTQ youth said that these threats cause them anxiety often, and that number went up if you looked at transgender youth specifically. Cultural competence. So what can you do as a counselor? The presence of an accepting adult is a very protective factor. Unfortunately, only about 1/3 of teens say that they live in an affirming home. And so if you are in a school or in your community, being a accepting adult is a very protective factor. As a counselor, you need to be aware of your biases and examine your own thought processes. I think it would be very helpful to reflect on your own sexuality and your own gender identity and how you came to terms with that, and be comfortable with who you are in your own sexuality. And then, of course, continuing education is vital. This group faces different challenges and they need different tools, and you need to be educated in what specifically helps them. So looking at some barriers to seeking help and coping strategies, there are a lot of LGBTQ youth who experience homelessness. They're about 120% higher risk of being homeless compared to their heterosexual or cisgender peers. Black and Native Alaskan and Native American LGBTQ have higher rates, significantly higher rates than their white LGBTQ counterparts. Additionally, transgender and non-binary youth of color have the highest rates of all. And this high rate of homelessness is accredited to the fact that only 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth say that they live in an affirming home. And also, there is additional discrimination that these people can face in shelters, specifically transphobia and not being able to be accepted in the shelter or the program that would align with their gender identity. Beyond being homeless, even those with homes, about 30% are food insecure, and that jumps up to 50% when you look to indigenous LGBTQ youth. And then looking at substance abuse disorders, LGBTQ adults are twice as likely to experience a substance abuse disorder, and that goes up to 4 times as likely for transgender adults. And if you look specifically at the youth, there's a significantly higher rate of illicit drug use for LGBTQ youth compared to heterosexual youth in high schools. And so this is assumed to be a coping strategy for dealing with discrimination, and interpersonal issues, and another coping mechanism is self-injury. Specifically, like we said earlier, there was a lot of intrapersonal reasons for doing so. Looking at multi-generational trauma in historical events. So this is a very, very abbreviated version. And so the Stonewall riots happened in 1969, and they are accredited with starting the modern day Pride movement. Of course, there were LGBTQ people before then who had riots and communities and things like that, but this is accredited with kind of starting the modern day Pride movement, and it was a police raid on a well-known inn that was a safe space. After that, we have the AIDS epidemic, which was very tragic and a very important historical event to the community. It happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, and it disproportionately affected gay and bisexual men. Lots of advancements have been made. However, there are still lots of people who still get it today, and it is still a disease that unfortunately affects men who have sex with men more readily than other populations. Also, it has caused the death of lots of people who were very important in the LGBTQ community, and it's still felt to this day. And then jumping forward to about 2015, there was Obergefell v. Hodges, and so this is what made gay marriage legal in all 50 states. So it has only been legal in all 50 states for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years this year. And with that in mind, there is still a plethora of anti-LGBTQ policies that are continuing to be placed out, and there's continuing rhetoric, and there's rhetoric against Obergefell and Hodges, and so that is obviously something that sits deep with lots of people in the community. Looking at the counseling approach and interventions that you can use. So for LGBTQ youth, family-based therapies can be very helpful depending on if the family wants to get involved, and you can look at the kind of power dynamics in the family, or how this person feels within their family, and the gender norms, the ideas about sexuality and religion and things like that. So acceptance and commitment therapy has been shown to be very useful in letting people accept who they are. And then solution-focused brief therapy is also an evidence-based technique that has been used successfully with LGBTQ youth. Regardless of the modality, the coming out process is going to be something that you're likely going to help guide them with, or this kind of process with, especially if you are counseling young teens. As a therapist, you need to ensure that you're giving affirming care and that you are trying to foster their social relationships. Having a strong social connective relationship is a very good preventative factor for self-injury and suicide. And also, positive self-concept is a great preventative factor, and fostering those two things in therapy can be very beneficial. Looking at religion and spirituality, this was very interesting to me. It said about 21% of all the surveyed LGBTQ youth said that religion and spirituality were very important to them. I'm sorry, I just realized that important got all mixed up in that. And looking at it regionally in the United States, the South has the most people who identify that religion and spirituality are the most important to them, are very important to them. However, it's only about like 1 or 2% above the lowest one, which if you look at the differences in race, you can see that Native and Indigenous individuals who are LGBTQ are more likely to say that religion and spirituality is very important, or just important to them, as well as Middle Eastern and Northern African LGBTQ youth. So there are some good and there's some bad with religion. Looking at LGBTQ youth, you can see that for most of these things, the importance of religion and spirituality does not really affect the way that these things are experienced. However, if you look at the recent depression, there's about a 3% difference in saying that religion and spirituality is not important versus it is. And this was a study on over 30,000 individuals. And so this was clinically significant. And so it said that it was linked with lower rates of recent depression. Unfortunately, there is a bad aspect about it. And so many religious groups are anti-LGBTQ. And regardless of if the person, like the youth, said that religion was important to them or was not important to them, if they heard their parents saying negative things about their community with using religion as that base point, it was linked with higher rates of suicide attempts. Alrighty, and so to conclude, I want to just reflect and say that this is a growing issue for a growing population. So if, as a counselor, you are likely, especially if you're using younger clients, this is something that you're going to encounter. And also, it is very important to remember that transgender and youth of color, specifically transgender youth of color, have the most negative outcomes and are the most effective. Social factors can be very preventative if they have a strong social network, if they have this affirming care. And acceptance and validation is a very important part of whichever modality of therapy that you use to work with these clients. And then lastly, I just want to leave you with a question. Are you a supportive adult? I know a lot of you work in your community or work with children, and I just want to ask you if you're doing your best to be a supportive adult. You might not know who needs it. And then these are the resources. And obviously not going to read all of them, but I would recommend the Trevor Project. Just any of the articles I read on there were really amazing. And it would be really helpful and really helpful to read, especially if you're trying to be a supportive adult. All right, thank you.